Jai Hind. Welcome to today's lecture on Vivekananda and Tilak on peace and conflict as part of our module on modern strategic thought. Today, we are going to explore two of the most influential thinkers of late 19th and early 20th century of India, Swami Vivekananda and Bal Gangadhar Tilak. While both were contemporaries and both sought India's liberation, their approaches to peace, conflict, and national regeneration were remarkably different yet complementary. Understanding their philosophies is not merely an academic exercise. Their ideas continue to shape contemporary debate on India's strategic culture, the role of moral value in statecraft, and the balance between idealism and pragmatism in national policy. Moving forward, before we delve into Vivekananda and Tilak specifically, let's contextualize their thought within the broader evolution of Indian strategic thinking. The first point is the transition from military strategy to moral political thought. You will recall from our earlier lectures that Indian strategic thought has a long and rich tradition from the Arthashastras, realpolitik to the dharmic principle of warfare in the epics. However, by the late 19th century, we see a fundamental shift. The strategic question was no longer about how one kingdom defeats another through military prowess. Instead, it became how does a colonized nation regain its sovereignty. The second point is the colonial encounter reshapes the strategic thinking. The British colonial presence forced Indian intellectual to rethink strategy entirely. Traditional military confrontation was impossible. The British had superior weaponry, organization, and resources. So the battlefield shifted. Strategy became about consciousness, identity, moral legitimacy, and mass mobilization. This is crucible uh, in which both Vivekananda and Tilak forged their ideas. Integration of Indian philosophical tradition with nationalism. What's fascinating is how both thinkers reached back into India's philosophical and cultural heritage, the Vedas, the Upanishad, the Bhagavad Gita, and reinterpreted these texts not as ancient relics but as living guides for contemporary actions. They indigenized nationalism, making in root, making and rooted in Indian soil rather than simply mimicking European nationalist movement. Another point is their debate on means and ends. At the heart of their thinking lies a fundamental question that remain relevant today. Do the ends justify the means? Is violence ever permissible in pursuit of liberation? Can true peace exist without justice? Can a nation achieve freedom through purely spiritual means, or must political actions, even militant actions, be embraced? So there are two contrasting visions to it. And this brings us to our two uh, protagonists, Vivekananda and Vivekananda, who emphasized spiritual strength and inner transformation, and Tilak, who prioritized political action and assertive nationalism. Let's explore each in depth. Let me introduce you to Swami Vivekananda. Born as Narendranath Datta in 1863 in Calcutta, passed away in 1902 at the young age of 39. Vivekananda was primarily a spiritual leader, a disciple of Sri Ramakrishna Paramhans, but his impact on Indian nationalism and strategic thought cannot be overstated. He famously represented Hinduism at the Parliament of the World's Religion in Chicago in 1893, where he introduced the Western introduced the West to Vedanta philosophy and challenged colonial stereotypes about India being a land of snake charmers and superstitions. Spiritual nationalism and moral strength. Vivekananda's core philosophy can be summarized as spiritual nationalism. He believed that India's weakness was not military or economic but spiritual. The nation had lost confidence in its own civilization, internalized colonial inferiority, and forgotten its glorious heritage. Therefore, regeneration must begin from within through spiritual awakening. Another point is the national regeneration through spiritual awakening. For Vivekananda, real power, Shakti, comes from spiritual consciousness. A nation that knows its cultural worth, that has a strong individual with moral courage, cannot be truly subjugated. Political freedom would naturally follow spiritual freedom. This was not escapism or other worldliness, it was strategic thinking at a different level. Moving forward, let's unpack Vivekananda's foundational principle that underpin his approach to peace and conflict. The first argument is the strength as foundation. The weak have no place in this life for the next or the next. This is perhaps Vivekananda's most famous and controversial statement. He was deeply critical of of the weakness, both physical and mental, and he observed in colonial India that he observed in colonial India. He was not advocating social Darwinism or brute force, rather, he was attacking servility, fatalism, and the interna internalization of inferiority. He would say, you are the children of immortal bliss. Why do you cry like weaklings? This was a call to recognize inherent divinity and strength. Weakness for Vivekananda was the only sin. Next argument is spiritual power, that is national strength rooted in spiritual consciousness. Vivekananda located the source of national power not in material resources but in spiritual consciousness, what we might today call civilizational confidence or strategic culture. A spiritually awakened nation would naturally develop the will, unity, and resilience necessary for liberation. The third argument was self-confidence, which is basically cultural pride as basis for national assertion. This principle directly challenged colonial discourse that portrayed India's culture as backward, superstitious, and inferior. Vivekananda argued that India's philosophical tradition, Vedanta, Yoga, Yoga, the concept of universal divinity, were profound contribution to human civilization. Culture pride was not chauvinism, it was the foundation for self-respect and national assertion. The next argument was the unity in diversity, universal brotherhood, transcending differences. Despite his emphasis on Hindu philosophy, Vivekananda was not sectarian. He preached universal brotherhood. Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vedanti. Truth is one, the wise call it by many names. He envisioned a united nation where religious, caste, and linguistic differences would be transcended by a shared sense of national purpose rooted in, rooted in universal spiritual values. Now, how did Vivekananda view conflict itself? Was he a pacifist? Absolutely not. His position was nuanced and deeply strategic. Conflict resolution require internal spiritual transformation. If we would like to elaborate this, for Vivekananda, that root cause of conflict, whether interpersonal or international, lies in ignorance, ego, and the false sense of separation between self and other. True and lasting peace require in internal transformation. External treaties and agreements are superficial if the underlying consciousness remain unchanged. The another argument was the true peace exists only between equals, not through domination. This is crucial. Vivekananda rejected the colonial Pax Britannica, the so-called peace imposed by British rules. He argued that such peace is merely the silence of the oppressed, not genuine harmony. Real peace requires mutual respect between equals. Therefore, India must first become strong and equal to negotiate genuine peace. The third argument was rejection of false peace, the silence of the oppressed. Vivekananda was scathing in his criticism of those who confuse submission with peace. He would say that accepting tyranny in the name of non-violence is cowardice, not virtue. The oppressed must find their voice and, if necessary, their strength to resist. War justified to protect innocent and resist tyranny. The third argument. And yes, Vivekananda believed that war could be justified in this interpretation of the Bhagavad Gita. He saw Arjuna's dilemma and Krishna's counsel as a teaching about righteous action. When innocent lives are at stake, then tyranny must be resisted. Defensive or protective violence becomes a moral duty, that is Kshatriya Dharma. Moving forward, let's elaborate on Vivekananda's concept of peace through strength. a principle that resonates with contemporary strategic thinking. So first argument is, or first principle is not pacifism but dignified strength and moral courage. Vivekananda's philosophy was not passive non-violence in the absolute Gandhian sense. It was about dignified strength. He wanted Indians to develop both the capacity for violence and the moral restraints not to use it unnecessarily. True peace comes from strength that choose restraints, not weakness that has no choice. The next principle was strength for self-defense and dignity, not aggression. He was clear. Strength is for self-defense, for protection of the vulnerable, for maintaining dignity, never for aggression or domination for others. This aligns with traditional Indian concept of dharmic warfare, violence as a last resort and always bound by ethical constraints. Another principle was physical, intellectual, and spiritual development is necessary. Vivekananda advocated a holistic approach to strength. He established educational institutions, encouraged physical exercise and sports, promoted intellectual development through scientific education, and of course, spiritual practices. He famously said, "You will be nearer to heaven through football than through the study of the Gita." This shocked many of the orthodox people, but Vivekananda understood that a physically weak, mentally servile population could not achieve liberation, no matter how many scriptures they memorized. The next principle was economic justice essential for sustainable peace. That was final. Finally, Vivekananda recognized that peace without economic justice is unsustainable. He was deeply concerned about poverty and advocated for the upliftment of the masses. Service to the poor was not charity but recognition of divinity in every human being. So, what was Vivekananda's practical strategy for national regeneration? Education and upliftment of masses as priority. That was one of the practical strategy. First and foremost, mass education, not just literacy, but education that builds character, self-confidence, and practical skills. The Ramakrishna Mission, which he founded, focused heavily on education and social services. Another uh, mission was revival of indigenous knowledge system. He advocated for the revival and revalidation of Indian knowledge system, philosophy, medicine, arts, science, not out of blind nostalgia, but to rebuild civilizational confidence and offer alternatives to purely Western paradigms. Service to humanity, that seva as a spiritual practice. This was revolutionary. Vivekananda redefined spirituality from renunciation to engagement. Seva, that is selfless service, become a spiritual practice. Serving the poor was serving God. This provided a spiritual justification for social activism. So, next is individual transformation leading to collective awakening. His strategy was bottom up, transform individuals through education, spiritual practice, and service. Awakened individuals would form the nucleus of national regeneration. In this sense, Vivekananda was thinking about long term cultural transformation rather than immediate political tactics. So, let us move forward and will shift to our second figure, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, born in 1856, 7 years before Vivekananda, and lived until 1920. Unlike Vivekananda, Tilak's arena was primarily political activism and assertive nationalism. Tilak was a political leader, journalist, and social reformer. He founded newspapers like Kesari the Lion and Maratha to spread nationalist consciousness. He was one of the first leaders to articulate mass nationalism and to transform the Congress from an elite debating society into a mass movement. Swaraj is my birthright and I shall have it. This slogan, Swaraj is my birthright and I shall have it, become the rallying cry for Indian nationalism. Notice the assertive tone. It's not a request or a petition, it's a declaration of natural right. Tilak transformed the psychological relationship between colonizer and colonized. The British imprisoned him multiple times for sedition. His trials become political theatres where he defended Indian nationalism with legal and philosophical arguments. He was called Lokmanya, uh, beloved of the people, because he connected with the masses in ways few leaders of the time did. So, did Tilak, Tilak means by what did Tilak mean by Swaraj? It was a comprehensive vision encompassing multiple dimensions. So, what are these dimensions? The first is self-rule as natural right, not granted favor. First and foremost, Swaraj was a natural right inherent to every individual and nation. It was not a favor to be granted by the British through constitutional reforms. This philosophical position fundamentally challenged colonial legitimacy. The second was political, self-governance free from colonial rule. Obviously, the political dimension was paramount. Complete self-governance, Indian governing in India through indigenous institutions, no foreign control, no aligned bureaucracy. Third was economic, self-sufficiency and Swadeshi, that is indigenous production. But Swaraj also had an economic dimension. Tilak was an early advocate of Swadeshi, the use of indigenous good and the boycott of British products. He understood that political freedom without economic self-reliance would be hollow. The drain of wealth from India to Britain had to be stopped. The fourth one was the cultural, the revival of Indian tradition and values. Cultural Swaraj for Tilak, like Vivekananda, wanted to revive Indian cultural traditions, but but his approach was more overtly political. He transformed religious festivals like Ganesh Chaturthi and Shivaji Jayanti into an occasion of nationalist mobilization. Religion and cultural Religion and culture become vehicle for political consciousness. So, what was central to Tilak's philosophy was his interpretation of the Bhagavad Gita, which he wrote about extensively while imprisoned. So, the first interpretation of Bhagavad Gita is justifying political actions. Tilak Gita Rahasya, the secret of the Gita, argued that the Gita's core teaching is Karma Yoga, selfless action. Unlike interpretation that emphasize renunciation, or devotion, Tilak emphasized action. The Gita was a call to fight dharmic battles, not to withdraw from the world. Karma Yoga, selfless action as duty, that is dharma. Karma Yoga for Tilak meant engaging in political actions not for personal gain but as a duty to the nation, just as Arjun had to fight because it was his dharma as a Kshatriya. Indian had to struggle for Swaraj because it was their dharma as a human being with inherent dignity. So, next was violence justified when necessary for righteous cause. And here is where Tilak diverged sharply from later Gandhian philosophy. In the Gita, Krishna tells Arjuna to fight. Violence, Tilak argued, could be justified when the cause is righteous, when all other means have failed, when it is the only way to resist tyranny and protect dharma. Next argument was measure for measures, justified retaliation and self-defense. Tilak spoke of measure for measure, that is proportional retaliation. If the opponent uses force, you respond with force. This was strategic thinking grounded in realism, not idealism. He saw no virtue in unilateral disarmament or turning the other cheek when faced with systematic oppression. So, what were Tilak's practical method of resistance? He pioneered several strategies that later become standard in the nationalist movement. The first was mass mobilization using festival for political consciousness. Tilak brilliantly used cultural festivals for political mobilization. This public celebration of Ganesh Chaturthi in Maharashtra, for instance, became a space where thousands gathered, nationalist songs were sung, and political speeches were delivered. The British could not ban religious festivals. Tilak used them for political purposes. Similarly, celebrating Shivaji Jayanti reminded people of Maratha resistance to Mughal rule. A coded message about resisting British rule. These were strategic uses of cultural symbol for political ends. The second was the boycott. Non-cooperation with the British goods and institutions. The boycott movement, refusing to buy British goods, encouraging Indian industries, was economic warfare. It hit the British where it hurt, their profits. Tilak understood that colonial rule was fundamentally about economic exploitation, so economic resistance was strategically sound. Third was passive resistance, civil disobedience, and non-payment of taxes. Tilak also advocated passive resistance, civil disobedience, refusal to cooperate with British laws and institutions, non-payment of unjust taxes. These methods would later be systemized and expanded by Gandhi. The fourth was active resistance, did not rule out militant action when necessary. But here is the key difference. Tilak did not rule out active, even militant resistance when necessary. While he personally focused on legal and mass mobilization methods, he never condemned those who chose more militant path. He believed that different situations might require different tactics. Moving forward, this brings us to one of the most important aspects of Tilak's thought, his explicit divergence from Gandhi's principle to total ahimsa or absolute non-violence. So, fundamental disagreement with Gandhi's absolute non-violence is one of the arguments. So, and while Tilak and Gandhi both wanted Indian independence, they disagreed fundamentally on means. Gandhi believed in absolute non-violence under all circumstances, even if it meant accepting oppression. Tilak could not accept the position. He also rejected Gandhi's total ahimsa as impractical. Tilak argued that total ahimsa was impractical in a world where power determined outcome. If the opponent has no moral communication and use violence freely, unilateral non-violence becomes a strategic disadvantage, even a form of complicity with injustice. He also viewed satyagraha as weapon of the weak. Tilak controversially called satyagraha a weapon of the weak, implying that those who had the capacity to resist forcefully but choose passive resistance were making a strategic error. Now Gandhis would encounter that non-violence required greater courage than violence, and there is a merit to that argument. But Tilak's point was about effectiveness, not courage. He also advocated militancy over uh, mendicancy for self-respect. Tilak often contrasted militancy with mendicancy, begging for rights versus demanding them. He believed that petitioning the British, appealing to their sense of justice, was futile and undignified. Self-respect required assertiveness, even defense. This is crucial debate in strategic thought, the tension between moral idealism and political realism, between the ethics of ultimate ends and the ethics of responsibility. So, let's now directly compare Vivekananda and Tilak in uh, Vivekananda and Tilak to highlight their key differences. So, first let's discuss the Vivekananda. His understanding was spiritual transformation as foundation. Vivekananda believed that external political freedom must follow internal spiritual freedom. Change the consciousness and political change would follow naturally. Strength through consciousness. Power for Vivekananda came from spiritual awareness, recognizing the divine within, uh, overcoming fear and servitude through self-knowledge. Next was the universal brotherhood. His ultimate vision transcended nationalism while he loved India. He saw the nation as a vehicle for spiritual value that were ultimately universal. All humanity was one. All humanity was one family. Vasudev Kutumbakam. Now let's discuss Tilak. What was his key point? He said that political action as priority. Tilak believed that political freedom was the immediate priority, spiritual and cultural revival were important, but political subjugation was the most pressing problem requiring urgent action. He also argued that strength through organization. Power come from organized collective action, mass movement, economic boycotts, political parties, strategic coordination. Everything is representation of actions and power. Nation as primary identity. While Tilak appreciated culture diversity, his primary focus was on building a unified national identity capable of challenging British rule. The nation state was the primary unit of political loyalty. These differences were not contradiction, they were complementary approaches operating at different level and time scales. So, despite these differences, Vivekananda and Tilak shared significant common grounds. Now we are going to discuss the common ground. What what was the common between both of them? Both emphasized strength over weakness and submission. Both utterly rejected the colonial narrative that Indians were naturally weak, servile, or suited for subjugation. Both called for cultivation of strength, whether spiritual or political, as the foundation of the liberation. Both also rejected passive acceptance of colonial domination. Neither was willing Neither was willing to accept British rule as natural, beneficial, or permanent. Both were deeply subversive of colonial legitimacy, through they expressed this subversion differently. Though they expressed this subversion differently, both drew from Indian philosophical and cultural tradition. Both reached into India's philosophical heritage, the Vedas, Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, the example of historical figures, and reinterpreted these traditions as resource for contemporary nationalist struggle. They Indianized nationalism. Both also inspired more Both also inspired mass nationalist consciousness in different ways. Vivekananda through spiritual organization, its educational institution and inspirational writings. On the other side, Tilak through political journalism, mass mobilization and assertive leadership. Both expanded the base of nationalism beyond English, educated elites to include ordinary people. So, what were the strategic implications of their thought for India's nationalist movement? Vivekananda, for Vivekananda, long-term cultural regeneration strategy. Vivekananda's approach was long-term and foundational. He was building civilizational confidence, creating institution of education and services and service, transforming individual consciousness and political payoffs might take generations, but the foundation would be solid. This is what we call a grand strategy, thinking in terms of decades or even centuries, focusing on foundational source of power, culture, education, values, social cohesion. On the other side, Tilak, uh, immediate political mobilization and confrontation was his idea. Tilak's approach was more immediate and tactical. He was building a political movement, mobilizing masses, confronting colonial authority directly. He wanted Swaraj in his lifetime, not in some distant future. This is operational or tactical strategy. Focus on immediate goals, creating political pressure, leveraging current opportunities. Both influenced subsequent nationalist movement. Interestingly, elements of both approaches can be seen in later leaders. Gandhi combined moral spiritual emphasis like Vivekananda with mass political mobilization like Tilak. Through his absolute non-violence differed from both. Subhash Chandra Bose, militant nationalism echoed Tilak. Nehru focused on institutional building and education reflected Vivekananda's long-term vision. So, what was the tension between spiritual and political approaches? The tension between spiritual and political approaches continues. Even in independent India, in today's scenario, this tension persists. Should India's strategic culture emphasize moral authority and soft power? That is Vivekananda's legacy. Of military strength and real politics? Tilak's legacy. Should policy prioritize long-term cultural preservation or immediate political and economic gains? These debates are alive today. Let's conclude by reflecting on the contemporary relevance of these two thinkers. The first the debate on self-defense versus the absolute non-violence persists. India's strategic debate still grapple with questions they raised. Should India maintain a no first use nuclear doctrine? How should we respond to terrorism? What are the limits of restraints? These questions echo the Vivekananda Tilak Gandhi debates on violence and non-violence. Role of cultural confidence in national power remain relevant. In today's era of soft power and civilizational discourse, Vivekananda's emphasis on cultural confidence is increasingly relevant. India's projection of yoga, Ayurveda, classical arts, philosophical tradition. This is this is Vivekananda's vision manifesting in contemporary foreign policy. Balance between moral values and political pragmatism. Every democracy struggles with this balance. Should foreign policy be guided purely by national interest, that is realism, or also by moral values and international norms, that is idealism? India's foreign policy often tries to balance these, maintaining strategic autonomy while claiming moral high grounds. This reflects both Vivekananda's more emphasis on Tilak's political realism. Integration of traditional wisdom with modern challenges. Both thinkers showed us how to draw on traditional wisdom, not as dogma but as living resources, while addressing modern challenges in an era where India seeks to be both modern and rooted, both globally engaged and culturally authentic. Their, their synthetic approaches uh, offers valuable lessons. So, let me conclude today's lecture. Vivekananda's spiritual nationalism and Tilak's political activism provided complementary approach to India's liberation struggle. Vivekananda gave us the why India deserved freedom, why its civilization was valuable, why Indians should have confidence in themselves. He built the psychological and cultural foundation. On the other side, Tilak gave us how to mobilize masses, how to resist strategically, how to demand rather than beg for rights. He built the political infrastructure. Together, they represent a holistic approach to national liberation that integrated spiritual depth with political action, long-term vision with immediate tactics, moral idealism with strategic realism. Their debates on the role of violence, the relationship between spiritual and political freedom, the balance between universal values and national interest remain alive in Indian strategic thought today. As a student of strategic studies and peace studies, I encourage you to reflect on these questions. What should be the foundation of national power? How do we balance ethics and effectiveness in statecraft? How do we draw on our traditions where remaining relevant uh, to contemporary while remaining relevant to contemporary challenges? I leave you with these questions today, and next lecture we'll discuss the Nehru and Gandhi. Thank you.